All right, so today we're going to be talking about IFR, departure to destination, that time between departing our originating airport and the arrival all the way into our destination. So we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about departure and approach plates for sure, flying the plan, a little bit on that, talk about encountering unexpected weather, kind of handling that. Also how to obtain some weather en route, kind of looking ahead there, staying ahead of the plane, as well as emergency procedures, because emergency procedures when it comes to IFR, obviously, are going to be a bit more complex and a bit different. Can be some hard set procedures for us to follow when it comes to any kind of emergencies we got going on while we're flying IFR, and especially when we're actually IMC in the clouds. And then wrapping it up, looking just to stay ahead of the airplanes, kind of the whole name of the game when it comes to IFR. Staying ahead of that airplane, it's very hard to catch up when you fall behind. So I'm going to get as much done ahead of time as possible. All right, so departure and approach. I'm going to get a thorough briefing in on these. Looking at the notes for sure. You can see up there at the top of the departure plate, one we got there on the left, some notes for RNAV and DME and GPS equipment required and radar required. Making sure you're equipped in those areas, as well as the takeoff minimums kind of down to the left there we can see, which are refer to performance limitations or performance requirements of our aircraft. There's one out of my airport. We got to have a certain feet per minute climb for nautical miles, certain climb gradient to clear an obstacle. So just checking those, checking NOTAMs obviously for these, as well as on top of the note and the other takeoff minimums. We want to be aware of any NOTAMs out for those that might change procedures or equipment required. Same with the approach plate, checking the NOTAMs, checking not really any notes. There's a note section up there in the top left, just below kind of where the approach portion localizer or ILS frequency would be. So checking in there if there's anything applicable to us that we need to brief while we're briefing our approach plates. We want to make sure we cover that. All right, so when it comes to actually flying the plane, again, we're going to have that thorough departure briefing. So if anything does go wrong, we know exactly what we're going to do. We know what the plan is. Having a backup plan is always a great idea, especially when it comes to IFR. Something I like to do is, most of them are going to be GPS or RNAV based nowadays, flying out, especially where I am. So heading out, it is a GPS again. And what I do is I set up the VOR as a backup, just in case. Set it up on the course that the departure plate discloses and tells me to set it to. I think it's about a 236 course inbound. So we just set up the CDI for that, just as a backup. So if we do have a failure, we can just flip right over into the VOR nav mode and we'll be good to go. As far as any other backup things we kind of want to have ready, is maybe some charts is a good idea for sure. Electronic flight bags are great, but it is good to always have a paper just as a backup. You never know what your electronics might do, and sometimes they like to act up on us. So just being prepared. So en route situation awareness. Now we're kind of at departure. We're getting into the en route here, cruising along. It can be easy just to kind of get back there and relax, put the autopilot on and look outside, look at all the nice scenery and clouds and whatnot we got going on outside. But we do want to make sure we stay situationally aware, looking for alternates, using resources available to us, just kind of being prepared, monitoring our aircraft systems, avionics, engine instruments, all of those, monitoring the weather. We're going to get into that a little bit more here shortly. For approaches, loading up the approaches if we can, if what we might expect an approach to be, so we can kind of get the weather. We'll talk about it again in a minute. Get up the weather for our destination, what we might expect, just take an educated guess so we can at least get something going. Or if we heard any other aircraft on frequency getting that certain approach for our airport, we can go ahead and expect that, get it loaded into the GPS, brief it, make sure we're ready to go on the approach, as well as the missed approach. And once again, checking the weather, which we're going to get into here. So en route weather, when it comes to getting the weather, we got a few different ways of doing it here for sure. A lot of options out there today. Some of the predominant ones are going to be flight services still available to us on some VOR frequencies we can use. Call them up on the radio, get a little bit of a weather briefing from them. Onboard equipment for sure. We got very advanced avionics out there today. Nowadays, and we can use those to our advantage, looking up METARs and TAFs on our screens that we got. And obviously there is pulling up the frequency, which is always the most common, always a great one to do, no matter what you're getting your weather with. Even if you get it a bit ahead of time, it's always good to go back and make sure if you get closer, you get it from the actual ATIS or AWOS or ASOS on frequency. And then, of course, we got our mobile devices, electronic light bags and whatnot, iPhones, iPads, whatever you got. You can pull up some weather on there as well, is always good. And then, of course, ATC is one of those ones that can kind of get neglected sometimes, but we still want to make sure we have that resource available to us and that it's known that we have that resource available to us if we so needed it. That is something we can use. Well, when it comes to unexpected weather, icing is one of the biggest concerns when it comes to instrument flying, especially for general aviation aircraft that I want to touch on. And the reason for it is a killer. It is a very serious situation if we start picking up ice or any amount of ice, even little bits. Starts to get into a situation, it can snowball from there. So real quick, a few different types of ice to watch out for after we got clear ice. Obviously, it's clear, can be hard to detect on that white wing out there flying along, especially in clouds. It is the heaviest, which is part of the reason it is very dangerous. It accumulates quickly. You can see there on the little image, it takes up a lot of room on our airfoil, really messing up the aerodynamics of it, disturbing that lift, increasing the weight, separation of the air from our airfoil, not good at all. Rime is a little bit different here. It's going to look a little rougher. It's got some like horns or ridges on it there. You can see in the little image there on the right wing there. So it's a bit easier to detect. This is something I have seen just the very beginning of flying through a very thin layer of clouds once before. And then mixed ice is just that. It's a combination of the two. So just a little bit of clear, a little bit of mixed coming together there. Now let's say we do get into an icing condition here. First thing we want to do is we want to get clear of it, right? So we're going to either descend or climb. Most commonly, we've probably climbed up into it, so we'll descend back out of it. We'll tell ATC, ask for help. If we're stuck in ice somewhere, they can get us some help. Ask other aircraft around us, give us some advice on where to maybe go, what altitude to use. And we got some anti-ice de-ice equipment on board. Definitely be using that. In our case, we usually don't. At the 172, all we got is pitot heat. That is definitely something we want to make sure we have on and use around that 6 degrees Celsius area, or even flying in clouds. Definitely want to have that on. At least it is something available to us. All right, so when it comes to emergency procedures, system failures, declaring our emergencies. Now, we could want to declare an emergency for any of these reasons. Radio issues, radio failures. We do this via our transponder, most likely, squawking 7600. Avionics failures. We're having any kind of avionics issues, pitot-static issues, clogged or blocked static ports, pitot tubes, things like that. Could certainly be an emergency condition, or weather conditions. We run into some kind of adverse weather. One of those could be icing or thunderstorms, or we end up flying into some really low IFR conditions that we need to get out of, and we're starting to get low on fuel. And we need to do something here, and it's kind of turned into a bad situation. So declaring an emergency would absolutely be the best course of action. All right, so when it comes to emergency procedures regarding radio failures, this is kind of one of the bigger ones that can get people that we want to make sure we are solid on when it comes to IFR flying. This is something that I was actually a little bit lacking on here in the past, which I kind of had to refresh myself. So squawk codes, we mentioned that just a few minutes ago, the 7600 VMC versus IMC. A little bit of a distinction here. VMC, if we are IFR and VMC in visual conditions, just to clarify on that, we can go land at an airport. And we just want to get on the ground as fast as possible. For IMC, we're going to have two acronyms here we can follow. First being the AVEF. We're going to go down this in order. So what we do is, firstly, we want to fly the last assigned route. Let's say we don't have one of those, it's not applicable. We'll fly any ATC vectors they have given us. Okay, let's say that's not applicable either. We'll fly any expected route ATC's given us. Or that is still not applicable to us, we'll fly what we filed. So if the first three aren't applicable and we got none of the first three, finally we'll fly what we filed in our flight plan. All right, now when it comes to what altitude we're going to want to fly, we've got the FAME checklist. So we're going to fly the highest of these following three here. So we're going to fly the highest of either our last assigned altitude by ATC, fly the highest of the minimum altitude along our route. So say along an airway, we got an MEA of 10,000, or an expected altitude from ATC. So if say the 10,000 was the highest out of a last assigned or an expected, we fly that 10. Eventually, we want to be as high as possible. Is kind of what we're looking for there. All right, so to wrap things up here for today, just a brief talk through there on departure, en route, and arrival. We talked about the approach plates and departure plates, covering those, looking at the notes, looking at the NOTAMs. Things can change, so it's good to have a thorough briefing on those so you know what to expect and what's going to be going on, what's kind of expected of you in terms of what you need to do and prepare for along those departures and approaches. And having those backup plans again, we talked about that a little bit. Adverse weather, obtaining information, what to do in the cases of adverse weather, such as icing. Again, we have ATC available to us. If we think an emergency is the right direction, I mean, we should call or declare an emergency. Absolutely do that. It's never necessarily the wrong thing. It's better to declare one and be safe than to not and end up potentially an accident and not good situation. Resources, we talked about those. We got onboard ATC again, our iPads available to us, the avionics, flight service, things like that. So just utilizing all available resources and those emergency procedures. VMC versus IMC. When it's VMC, it's pretty straightforward. Go land somewhere as soon as possible. For IMC, we got those two acronyms we can follow, the AVF as well as the FAME for our altitude. So just having those memorized is good for IFR flying for sure. Kind of just be ready for any situation there. And staying ahead of the airplane is kind of what everything wraps up together to. We want to stay ahead of that airplane. It's very hard to catch up once again if we fall behind. So staying ahead, being briefed prior, looking ahead to weather, looking ahead to our approach, briefing our approaches, looking ahead to any alternates, and always having a backup plan in mind. And a backup means of navigation for sure, but that just falls into that backup plan. So that's going to do it for today, covering that IFR, the departure from the departure to the en route and the destination, and that will do it.